Hello, welcome to Yeshua Television UK. My name is Pastor Jimba Alex, and the topic for today is going to be Colonial Masters Part 2. Last week I made Colonial Masters Part 1, and that's led me to do Colonial Masters Part 2. This is where I'm at right now. And yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on Yeshua Television UK, and I'm just gonna drive straight into the topic for today, which is Colonial Masters Part 2. I managed to find this picture, and yeah, it's about colonial Africa, how the European colonial masters went over Africa and they colonized the people. They ruled the people on their own land. Yeah, and they took over. So this is colonial Africa, the parts of Africa that got colonized, because I believe that it's not all over Africa that got colonized by the British Empire, but I also do believe that the colonial masters did go to Africa and they colonized a majority of parts of Africa. So before I go into this topic, which is Colonial Masters Part 2, I hope you like the picture of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, Yeshua. The original Jesus Christ of Nazareth, Yeshua. But that's a different topic altogether. The topic for today is Colonial Masters Part 2. So before I go into Colonial Masters Part 2, I'd like to give you a definition of what colonization itself really means. And colonization means having foreign policies and practices to control a weaker people on their own land. Can I share that again with you? The definition of colonization means having foreign policies and foreign practices to control or to rule a weaker people on their own lands. So that tells me that for the European British colonial masters to go over to Africa and colonize black people on their own lands, it means that black people in Africa during the 18th century, or as at that time when colonization took place, they were a weaker people. Maybe mentally, militarily, however you want to look at it, they were a weaker people. So I'll kick off this topic today, Colonial Masters Part 2, with saying that the European colonial masters never brought civilization to Africa. So they're making it look like in the history books like they brought civilization to Africa, but the colonial masters never brought no civilization to Africa. No, they didn't. Africa was already a civilized place before the European colonizers got there. Egypt is Africa. Egypt is black Africa. They were already rulers of the whole world. Mali had the greatest intelligence, not only in Africa, but in the whole world. The list goes on and on and on. The Benin Empire was so established and civilized that it was unbelievable. So the colonial masters never brought no civilization to Africa. Africans were already civilized. That's my point. Before the colonial masters, the colonizers, got to Africa, they were already civilized people. I mean, the black Africans on their lands, be it South Africa, be it Nigeria, be it Ghana, be it Togo, be it Benin Republic, whatever African country you want to name, they already had their own traditions and they were living in peace. If anything, it's the colonial masters that actually brought them confusion and segregation by bringing different tribes together. But that's not what I'm going today. I'm just trying to say that the black Africans already had their own traditions and their own peace and their own unity. Yes, they did. They had it. Of course they had it. The Africans, the black Africans on their lands already knew how to rule themselves because they had chiefs and kings. Of course they did. So never forget, the colonial masters, they arrived in Africa uninvited. That's my point. They arrived in Africa unannounced. The colonial masters arrived in Africa uninvited. That's like forcing your way into another man's property. It's unlawful. It's illegal. The colonial masters arrived with weapons. The colonial masters, they arrived with weapons and military and violence and aggression to colonize the African people on their own lands. I'm telling you, the colonial masters never went to Africa with peace or dialogue or negotiations. The colonial masters already knew that if they went to Africa with peace and harmony and seniority, it wouldn't work. So the colonial masters went to Africa, Black Africa per se, with the aid of violence and weapons. The colonial master was a bloodmonger. They shed a lot of African blood. Before they can control the black Africans on their own lands. The colonial master was a bloodmonger. The colonial masters, they fought wars centuries ago in Europe. So they were experienced. When they got to Africa, they knew what they were doing. They had a strategy. They had a strategy. And they had a deceitful plan. That's exactly what happened. The colonial master already had a strategy on how to rule black Africa on their own land. The colonial masters brought more darkness on African people. The black African people should have been left alone. They were not complaining. They never called no colonial master and said, listen, we're going through so much grief, and we're going through so much turmoil, and we're going through so much confusion. Please come to our lands and come and help us. The Africans never did that. They were peacefully living on their own lands. So I say it again, the colonial master brought more darkness and grief upon the black African people. The colonial masters, the history books might not tell you this, but the colonial masters were also after the African natural resources. If there was nothing to gain in Africa, then the colonial masters wouldn't be there. They were not just there to rule the people, they were also there to take and exploit the African natural resources. And not only were they to exploit and manipulate and take the African natural resources, the colonial masters were also there to take the natural resources and the minerals by force. The colonial masters showed black people too much hate on their own lands. And this thing that I'm talking about is still going on in the world today. The colonial masters showed black people so much hate on their own lands. Wow. Giving them instructions on their own lands. Giving them laws on their own lands. Ruling them on their own lands. Bringing them a belief that they might not even believe in. And forcing them to believe in it on their own lands. The colonial masters, they came to Africa in disguise. The colonial masters, they came to Africa in disguise. That's what they did. The black Africans never saw them coming. They came to Africa in disguise. The colonial masters, they call themselves colonial masters, but the truth of the matter, or the real question here is, who made them the masters in the first place? They made themselves the masters themselves. The black Africans never made them no masters. They forced the mastership and the rulership upon themselves. Everything was done by violence. Without no negotiations nor agreements. That is sad. That is sad. So the colonial master came to Africa with disguise. The colonial masters, they made themselves masters and rulers and leaders in a land that don't belong to them. Jesus Christ of Nazareth. What's going on, man? That's exactly what happened. The colonial masters made themselves rulers and kings and leaders on a land that don't belong to them. My question to you is, how can a stranger be a master or a leader or a ruler or on an African land? Think about that. So I'll even go as far as saying that the colonial masters took out their anger and frustrations on our black African ancestors. The colonial masters were already angry. The colonial masters were already frustrated. And they took it out on black Africans on their own land. Oh my God. It's disgraceful. The colonial master abused and victimized black people on their own land. They abused black people and they victimized them on their own land. You know, looking at it, reflecting on it, reminiscing on those events that took place from the colonial masters at the time, all I can say is that the colonial masters, for them to behave in the way they behaved and ruled black people on their own lands, the colonial masters themselves were uncivilized themselves. That's why I said in the initial part of this topic that the colonial masters never brought civilization to no African, to no black man. They didn't. They were uncivilized themselves. Because the Africans were civilized first. And I want you to understand that without the weapons and the military and the violence, then colonization would have taken place on African soil. Oh my God. You got to understand that. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. The colonizers, the colonial masters, they gave Africans fake education. They gave Africans fake education. They miseducated the Africans, and we're still suffering from it today. They brought upon us Western education, but we already had our own education. We already had our own style of mathematics. We already had our own languages. Why do I have to speak a European language to be recognized or to be accepted? That is miseducation right there. Learning a European language on my own soil is like starting all over again. It's like me saying that my own language is inferior to what the colonial master is bringing to us. They brought us fake education, fake and miseducation. You know, the colonial masters attacked rich African kingdoms. And I'll just give you 2 minutes to dwell on that. The colonial masters attacked rich African kingdoms. They were like parasites. So that's why when they got to Africa and they saw the riches that the Africans and the wealth, the riches and the wealth that the Africans possessed, they said, no, we're going to stay here. We're going to attack these people. You know what I mean? And the colonial master is part of the growth of the European empire. There's an indirect rule here. There's a disguise here. They made it look like they're coming to bring black Africans favors, but that's a lie. That's not the truth. The deception or the manipulation or the hidden agenda here is that the colonial master was part of the growth of the European empire. Hi. So the colonial masters were there to, to decline or to deconstruct the African empire to make the European empire the stronger and the wealthier. The colonial master was once a caveman. It's a fact. If you trace the history of the colonial master, he was once a caveman. So how can a caveman bring an African rich kingdom civilization? It don't work that way. So the colonial master came to Africa with a fake identity. He didn't come there with a visa. He didn't come there with a passport. He didn't come there with no documents. They just arrived and started doing what they had to do to dominate. They came there with a fake identity. And you know, I want you to understand today, this is Yeshua Television UK. And that's Yeshua himself, the original Jesus Christ of Nazareth. I want you to understand today that our black ancestors are still in the grave crying from what the colonial masters did to them. You've been watching Pastor Jimba Alex on Yeshua TV UK. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Colonial Masters Part 2. Peace be with you, man. Peace. There'll be no more making love, yeah. No more making love with you. Hey, yeah, no more making love. No more making love with you, yeah. Hey, oh.